Okay, let's get started. Now I gotta stop. Here's the deal. Don't have the microphone. This is being recorded. So I would ask.
Oh, okay. All right. For the viewing public, good evening. Welcome to our meeting this evening. It's nice to see all of you. I hope you had a nice, pleasant summer. I don't see a lot of yeses. It rained a lot. I know that. So tonight we're very fortunate. Well, before we even talk about the fortune of having Lee here, any comments or any corrections, deletions, or additions to last meeting notes? Okay, hearing none, I will presume that we're accepting them as they stand, correct? Okay, very good. All right, so the meeting tonight, Mr. Eisenweiler is going to tell us what kind of progress we're making, and it should be very interesting.
Thank you for the introduction, Dal. Yes. I'm on it. Better? Check, check. Test, test. 1, 2, 1, 2. Don't forget to tip your waitress. It's on. It's not very low. Test, test, test. Check. 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. Test, 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 test.
Test, test, test. Test, test.
Check, check, check. You want to put a different one down here?
We don't have another one to put down.
Do you want to put me somewhere else? I could work with Kim long distance.
Very good, Dan. They're going for us.
La 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 la. Thanks. So, this evening I want to share a couple things with you. One is, if you recall when we were preparing the plan amendment, we said that we would actually prepare some additional graphics that would end up in the document before it got adopted. So we've been busy working on that, and we're finding some intriguing results as we sort of test what we think some of the rules for the zoning code might be on some real sites. So this happens to be the Key Bank site. So the church is here, and this is Key Bank. And if that building were to be taken down, we can't put anywhere near as large a building back based on the parking ratios that we apply today. So while we think there's like this huge sink of parking there right now, it seems like the place is nothing but the big department store building and a huge parking lot. It actually, we had to dumb down this drawing in order to provide enough parking. So the residential is self-parked. So this component is a bunch of townhouses, as we originally showed during the charrette. And if you can see here, they're tuck under parked. So they're garage parked within the townhouses. So those are fine. All of that parking you see is for this modest bit of mixed use that's up front. And that's because of your current parking ratios. We actually had 3-story buildings, 2.5-story buildings, the whole distance. And we had to put in these smaller buildings because we literally could not accommodate enough parking at your current rates. So why is that? Well, right now you're parking apartments at 2 spaces per unit, which depending on the size of the apartment, might be appropriate and might not. But in many places, that would be considered a pretty high ratio. You're parking the retail, I believe, at 5.5 spaces per 1,000 square feet. In many cases now, especially mixed-use settings, we're using 4. Even if there were offices in here, you're parking offices at 5 per thousand. That would be a rate that we would use for medical office, but not necessarily for regular professional offices. We'd use a lower rate for that. So we clearly have proven out that if we want to stick with our urban form vision, we're going to have to really put a bent eye to some of the parking regulations and figure out how we can do a better job of that. Now, in talking with Scott and some of the others who do the development review here, it's clear how this has been worked out in the past, and that is that basically you allow an individual assessment, and so typically somebody coming in will meet the parking standard as much as they can, and then use the individualized assessment to get the exemption from the remaining portion that they can't fit on their site. So you are getting a reasonably good urban design, traded out for lower parking ratios. We went, Dan and I went to look at the, the limestone lofts, I think it was, the upper stories are called, but the new Bella Aqua on the east end of town, the new 3-story mixed-use building. And if you've ever been to the backside of that site, what you'll discover there is a fascinating and brilliant solution, which is that they installed parking on what really is almost their neighbor's site. So the old white clapboard building that's there on the corner has 0 parking, and the new building has parking that reaches around and behind that building. So it's, in essence, using the parking that is for the next door building, which got an exemption because it's an old building and it's been there forever. So even on existing projects, and that one was a joint project, of course, with the village. The village has no parking requirement for buildings that face Main Street, so things were worked out for that site. But again, you are right now kind of working parking out on a case-by-case basis, and it seems as though we're going to have to put a bent eye to some of the standards. But the reason we are trying to do some of this is to give people a sense of the character. So this is medium scale node on this side and low scale node on this side, if you recall. That's where the committee has placed it. That's what the plan amendment says right this minute. So you are seeing the 3.5 stories, so a habitable upper story there, 2 stories of residential, and then the mixed use built in on the ground floor. Could be office, could be retail, could be anything. It just needs to be built as though it were one day going to be retail. Then you see adjacent to it are the lower scale buildings, which are just mostly single-story retail. I would guess if somebody was building that second building, they would probably try to put a little bit of office in that second floor. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense necessarily to make that a tiny little residential floor like that, but it might make sense to lease it as office. So that's kind of where we're getting to in some of the testing. We're still working on this drawing. Eventually, a drawing like this will become part of the plan amendment to show what the possible form would be here. Now, if you imagine if we took the exact same site and now we put this in the center 5-story district, right, we'd be showing a very different pattern there. If we put it in the corridor district, again, the rules would be changing and we would see a different pattern. So what I'm going to show you tonight is a little bit of the regulations themselves that set those kinds of rules, and we're going to talk a little bit about what those differentiating factors are that really are going to set those different characters of places. So any comments or thoughts about this before I move on to some of the code pages? Anyone?
I want to make one comment just to remind folks, if you can, just think a little bit about these, because these are the images that are going to appear in the comprehensive plan. These are the images that should express those ideas in the comprehensive plan, the difference between form and type that you define in the plan. So remember, we had this conversation about putting specific measures in the plan, of trying to introduce specific information, sizes, things like that in the plan. Actually, we said, no, we don't want to do that. But we agreed that we put some images in there that would be good examples of the form and type of development we were looking for, that would suffice for those more specific measures. So that's what these are intended to do. They're there to kind of allow people to visualize kind of things we talked
right this minute, it's a little under-inspiring. So we've got to work on that a little bit. This is literally the first time we're seeing this drawing. We got it about 6 o'clock today, I think. So we're going to move on. I'm going to show you some of the pages out of the draft code so that you can begin to understand that we're actually getting somewhere beyond where we were. So one of the things that I'm going to start with, and your little packet has the exact same pages that we've got up here. So if you prefer to follow along from your packet, feel free. One of the things we discovered when we initially sent some of the pages to the staff was that they absolutely got stuck on some of the minor details, like how are you going to measure height, and how does this happen and how does that happen. They needed to know more about the metrics, so we've added this little bit of this piece that would eventually be in the code on what we call the rules of measurement. These are not trying to be the complete rules of measurement at this point in time. They were just enough to kind of answer some of the questions that staff was coming up with about the metrics that are on the individual pages. So I do want to show you a few of them. So if you go down slowly. Yes.
All right. I thought you were going somewhere different. I thought you were saying this is what it looks like this thing, parking requirements, and this is what we're going to propose to change parking requirements. That's not what we're doing. We're not going to change any of the parking requirements.
I think we're going to have to change some of the parking requirements, and at least in these center types that are mixed use.
All right, let's say construction can't
Next. Now. Not in the comprehensive plan, because the plan is setting the vision for the form. It does not have any of those metrics in it. But before this zoning can possibly go forward, absolutely has to be a discussion we hold. So we have great form that's unbuildable because it would underbuild every site in town if we use the existing metrics for parking. Unfortunately.
Generally, your conclusion was that we are over-parking development.
Yes. I would love to look at, the Thanksgiving Day Google image, the Friday after Thanksgiving Google image and see what we think. I was talking with somebody about the new Whole Foods, and, for the first week or two, completely packed on Saturday afternoon. Last couple of weeks, not so much. So, are we somewhere close to right? I don't know. Plenty of parking there, so it may not be the perfect example. That's as much development as we can fit on that site.
So even though we zoned it,
You're going to have some lower intensity buildings on the site just in order to be able to successfully park them. The focus on height is correct. If that 3.5-story building were immediately next to your single-family house, you might still be concerned about it. But yes, that intense drawing actually. No, we don't have it. It's okay. The intense drawing, the watercolor that was done at the time of the charrette that bothered everybody so much about this same area was a much more consistent pattern of development at about 3 stories tall. And in order to fit that, somebody would have to build structured parking. It does. It does. I think that is the answer to why things are working, somewhat functionally today, is that the pace of buildings is slow enough that those considerations happen, people can talk about it, and come to some reasonable compromise solution.
That if you're going to rely on the open and parking ratios, correct, every single project you did
Is
commercial areas would have to rely on the open and parking.
Yes. Yes.
Not the long-term solution.
Yes. Agreed. So, so one of the things we're going to do is have a look at some of those previously approved ones, and kind of put a bent eye to some of that, and then we'll have to talk some about sort of best practice for some of these ratios from other communities, and see where we're going. We're not going the Buffalo route of there's no parking. That's not an option here, at least right now. But we're going to have to get a lot closer. So especially if we're talking really about neighborhood serving commercial, that is intended to have some component of walking and biking. One of the principal reasons we put this piece up front is because unless you understand a few fundamental regulatory ideas, you aren't going to get the difference between buildings that will show up out of this. So I want to show you just a couple of things. Go down to the Build 2 one. This Build 2 zone, it's right here. So you could even blow it up if it will let you on that drawing. So one of the things is on the page that says Build 2 zone on it, there's this drawing. This is the tool of choice for almost all form-based coders now. Is instead of the permissive setback and just saying don't come any closer than this, now we say don't be any further away than this. And it's actually started to become a very sophisticated tool. In this case, we use a zone or a range with a minimum setback and a maximum setback. Don't come any closer than this. Don't push your building any further back than that. So that's the start, is your building has to sit in here somewhere. And in the most Main Street environments, that in here is the shallowest. You're bringing the building the closest to the street with the least ability to move it back and forth. In the suburban area, you're going to see you can push that building further back on the site, and you'd be allowed to do that. The other piece is, so that's forward and backward on the site. The other piece is the side-to-side piece. So this is expressed as a percentage of the width of the lot that must contain building. Doesn't necessarily mean one building. It could be 5 buildings across. But it's basically saying if the lot width is 100% and I say 70%, then I'm going to have 0.7 times the lot width that's going to be building. And then 30% would not have to be. It could be parking. It could be open space. It could be whatever. Stormwater. Any of the other elements of your site. But if I say 70%, that means 70% of your width has to have a building on it. So this set of tools is a really powerful way to change the form of development by manipulating the basic location of the building. So keep going down. Let's see what else we should talk about here. So another idea that is very important to many urban designers, if we were to take that Key Bank site and I say 70% Build 2 on it, you might decide to put it all the way on the western end. There's another idea floating around that most urbanists feel strongly about called hold the corner. And that is that when you are at an intersection of 4 corners, you want buildings at the intersection. You don't want huge open spaces there. Now, in the case of this, the image that we showed you to start with, of course, we're going to have an empty corner because of the church. But the church is a grand civic building. It is, out of the ordinary. It's an extraordinary civic presence. And it's okay to be different. But if all you're building is shops, we don't want some up to the corner and some pushed back. We don't want a non-formal pattern. We're trying to actually formalize this as a walkable Main Street. And so we use this rule that says at least some portion of your building has to be within 30 feet of the corner. You've got to be sitting inside the Build 2 zone there. What this allows us to do is maybe it's a small building that's in the corner of the site and a larger building further over, but it allows us to at least have some presence right there. And if you look today on at least the northwest and northeast corner there, there's nothing there. Or if we go to the corner that has the Manhattan Bagel and the kind of strange townhouse guys, back in the back, both of those sit behind large parking lots. Not a highly walkable kind of Main Street kind of an environment. So again, this is part of our toolkit for getting the building in the right place and getting the right pattern. Keep going. Parking setback is another important one. I'll show you what those numbers are. But basically what that does is pushes the parking back sometimes farther back than the building. Sometimes the parking setback's short and it's allowed to be in front of the building. But sometimes you don't ever want any parking in front of the building. So we use parking setback in addition to building setback in order to manipulate the parking location. In the bulk and mass world, the main thing everybody wants to talk about is how do you measure height. If you keep going down to the little image for height. So there are some important things. If we are going with 3.5 stories, the half story basically has to have, the habitable space has to be 7'6" tall, according to the building code, and it can't be more than 50% of the ground floor area of the story below it in order to be that half story. There's the challenge of mezzanine. Sometimes if you have a tall story, someone will want to slip a mezzanine in. So according to the building code, you can have 1/3 of the floor area of this room in a loft portion here. 1/3 of this floor area could be a loft, and this would still be considered 1 story because a mezzanine is not a story either. So these are some of the ways that people, work with the system to get more square footage often inside a building. Unfortunately, if we can't park it, they won't be pushing for that. So we may not see that. Go down to some of these others. So one of the other challenges is, what if we have a sloping site? This is a community that's going to have slope. And so, for example, for residential, we would rarely allow any more than 1-story walkout back behind, because a 4-story tall house seems a little odd. But we are saying right now that if you're 2 stories at the street, you're meeting your height requirement here, you can be 4 stories on the backside. So this is an important idea to know it might be coming. So we need to be especially aware of steeply sloped sites and what this possible impact would be. This is not the only way to regulate this. Some communities would notch this down as this height changed. But if we are mostly focused on how buildings feel from the street, that public realm, then this is an acceptable model. And so we draw this outcome so that people have seen it, that one as well. So the way that we're proposing to measure the height for these is that building height is the average of the highest and lowest elevations, so that we can deal with a little bit of grade change on the site and come out with an average answer. What else do we have pictures of? Often when we produce residential within a mixed-use setting, because we're pulling the residential close to the street, we want to elevate it. And that's to provide a sense of privacy for the residents. And so here you're seeing ground floor elevation. This is another metric that we'll be including in those instances where we have a fully residential ground story allowed. This one. So one of the final ideas we should probably talk about is transparency. So transparency is the notion of clear windows and doors. Very important on the ground story of buildings that are going to be retail, for example, that we have high levels of transparency. On the ground floor, we typically regulate between 2 and 12 feet. What that allows for most retail, you see very contemporary retail taking the glass to the ground. But in many, many cases, traditional retail is a couple of feet up, and there's what's called a kick plate down on the bottom, and that's where the snow piles up and all that other kind of stuff before you hit the window glass. So we measure between 2 and 12 feet, so you're not penalized for blocking off that lower portion. So we are going to be asking when we have commercial areas that we get high transparency on those ground floors. Go ahead, scroll on down. I don't think there's any more. Blank wall, it's right there. Blank wall is the opposite of transparency. So I don't know if you've ever seen, I suspect we could find a Wegmans, for example, that does the thing I'm about to describe. So often, the biggest offender is Target, for example. Often all the glass is on one end of the building along with the entrance. And if you look at the rest of the building, it's got a trellis pasted on or something else, but it's really fundamentally a blank wall. No windows, no nothing. And it may have met the transparency requirement, right? If it was, They meet it with all that glass they put on, but it's not distributed on the building, and therefore it's not helpful as the pedestrian. It's not creating pedestrian interest. So the blank wall requirement says there is a maximum distance that I should have to traverse before there should be windows again. So that's the principal idea behind using transparency plus blank wall, is to break it up as it moves along. The final idea is probably pedestrian access. So pedestrian access, it's important to note this is only on your building. You don't measure this against the next door neighbor's building and see whether your door is close enough to their door. This is only rules about how many doors you need. And it is really used to break up the rhythm of buildings. So on very large buildings that are in very large settings, it would be infrequent. And on Main Street buildings where you're expecting smaller shops, it would be more frequent. So that's one of the other metrics that we use to manipulate the urban form of the building. So on down, I think we'll get a page. So I wish we could show two at once. I don't think we can we? But at least go to the full page here. So it's okay. You're doing good. Hit it one more time. I think it should give you the full page. There you go. Okay, so the page layouts for the dimensional standards are 2 pages at a time. Can you just go down to the next page so you know that it exists? So there is a first page with the lot dimensions in 2D. The next page is 3 dimensions just as an envelope for bulk and mass. And finally, a fully dimensioned activation page for each of these. And we're going to look at some of the metrics for these particular ones that we chose. So if you blow up that table a little bit, it would be great. So on the lot, we're saying lot area is not important to us. If you choose to have a small lot and build a small building, that's just fine. We're not setting a minimum lot area. In the end, we may find we have to set sort of a de minimis standard like 2,000 square feet or something, but there isn't any reason not to think you might not have small commercial buildings here. No width, and here also no building coverage. And the principal reason for that is because if you regulate building coverage, we'll probably end up setting it at exactly whatever you get to on a typical lot anyway. It's not going to manipulate the form of the building, right? The building should be set in this Main Street environment. Remember, this one happens to be, I think, medium scale node. So the build to zone, the building setback, at least 5 feet, no more than 15 feet. So there's 10 feet of articulation that can be done on the face of your building, moving it in and out if you choose to. It could sit in a single plane within that 5 to 15 feet. It can all sit at 5, it can all sit at 15, or it can vary in and out. 70% building facade in the primary street build-to zone. So along Main, if you happen to be at Main and Eggert, along Main, 70% of your site has a building on it. Along the side street, 40%, a much lower number because we actually expect you to have a fair amount of parking back there. So there might have to be a little bit of an L on your building, as there is with the I can't say Belvac, whatever. Thank you. Can't say it. Just can't say it. The limestone locks. That building has a little bit of an L on it. If you go look at the back, the spa that goes up the side street is actually in an L of the building. Along a common lot line, you can go to 0. In a Main Street environment, buildings abut other buildings, right? Right up against each other. Along the alley, a 5-foot setback to make sure that we have adequate turning radius in and out from the alley into any garage or anything else. The parking setback is equally important. So we've got you from 0 to 15 feet. So no matter what, the parking is going to be behind or within the building. Now, in that 30% remaining, we're going to have 25 feet of landscaped area before the parking starts. Because again, I'm in a Main Street environment, so if I choose to have a shorter building, I want to have a good-looking piece of land next to that. I don't want the parking right up on top of me. So that primary street at 25 feet. The side street, on the other hand, is at 10 feet. That's just a landscape strip. It's a snow storage location. It's whatever it needs to be. On common lot lines, you can go to 0. So you can share your full parking lot with your neighbor, right? You can connect your parking right up. And on the alley, again, 5 feet of setback. In addition to the parking setbacks, then we get to the height and the mass. So in this case, 3 stories and 35 feet. So right this minute, we have the ground story height of 13 feet if it's a mixed-use building and 9 feet if it's a residential building. And I believe these are floor to floor. So at 9 feet floor to floor, actually I hope that's floor to ceiling. Just quick check how we set that. But these are not huge tall story heights. In fact, if that is only floor to floor, we're pretty close to the bare minimum that you ought to be doing. Hold on a second. Story height is floor to floor. So for 9 feet, you are measuring from the floor here to the top of the floor above me at 9 feet. That means probably we've got about a foot or more thickness in the floor. So my floor to ceiling is 8 feet. And that's about as low as you want to go. The building code allows you to go to 7'6", but that is not getting in anybody's way. It's not requiring a loft. It's not forcing anybody to do anything super tall. The ground story height at 13 feet is also pretty nominal. If you look at the height of the Starbucks space, admittedly in a renovated building, but most Class A retail space wants to be quite tall. And so here's at least a slightly taller building height for that ground story. And then you'll see that ground floor elevation that we talked about from 2 to 4 feet. So at least 2 feet up if it's residential, and at most 2 feet up if it's non-residential. And that's mostly because we have to make ADA work for the front door of the residential. So you're going to have to ramp up. So to get that 2 feet, you've got to go a fair ways in order to get to that door. And upper stories on both are presumed to be residential or office, and therefore set at 9. Now, does that require you to build only those numbers? No. These are the minimums. Now, if you count it up, you have 2 plus 13 plus 9 plus 9, 15, 33 of the 35 are chewed up there already. So you really only have 2 more feet on the mixed-use building that you could use somewhere. So the mixed-use building at 35 feet in height is still it's a fairly modest building in the scheme of things. It's not going to be tall grand floors. And I wish I knew how tall the limestone loft was right this minute, because I suspect that the loft floors for residential are a fair ways taller. We're seeing a lot of apartments at 12-foot ceilings now. So in addition to the height requirements, there is a building mass requirement of the street-facing building length. We may have set these too long for this kind of environment, but we had to start somewhere. So right this minute, we're saying it's 200 feet long. That is a long building. But it is probably 2/3 of a typical downtown block. I would guess, do you know what Buffalo's blocks are? Downtown Buffalo's? They're probably 200 to 300 feet per block for downtown Buffalo. So if you think of it as most of a downtown Buffalo block. And that may be too long in this environment. Maybe we want more of a break, and therefore we need that building to break more frequently than once every 200 feet. But we have that tool here, and we can calibrate it. Then, in addition to that, here's the transparency. 50% on the ground story on the primary street, on the side street, dropping the transparency, upper stories down to 20%, and 30 feet of blank wall on the face of the building, and 50 feet allowed on the side of the building. So a fairly simple pattern that gets us a pretty good outcome. If you walk past the spa in the new limestone lofts building, you'll find that all of the windows have been screened out and the transparency is gone. So when you go down the side or the front of that building along the spa space, they basically could have been inside an office building and you'd never know, because they don't really have any street front presence at all. In fact, the double doors for it are wooden doors, so there's not even any transparency on the doors. So that is not an allowed pattern in a retail, full-on retail environment. Now, not every center is going to be retail everywhere. So that might be okay on that building in its location. Here's the entrance spacing. A street-facing entrance is required. The spacing is 50 feet max on the primary street. That will give you a bay width of about 50 feet. And the depth of a mixed-use building is about 65 feet, right, because of a double-loaded apartment upstairs. So 50 times 65, you'll have about a 3,000 square foot space as your nominal spaces if you use up the entire space below a typical bay of apartments. Down the side street, you can increase that to 100 feet, and we actually typically allow the corner, if you put a clipped corner and the entrance at the corner, you can count that for both facades. So you could count it as the first 50 feet along the primary street and as part of the 100 feet down the side street. So you may not even need another door down the side street if your building's not more than 100 feet deep along there. In addition, we're talking about regulating some nominal building elements that are very often done in awkward ways. Anybody know what a Juliet balcony is? Dave does, of course. So a Juliet balcony is the balcony where you open the fabulous French doors and the railing is right there. There's not even one step out, right? So a Juliet balcony to me is no balcony at all. Yes, it's light and air inside your building, but you might as well have had a big picture window. You know, it doesn't give you any outdoor space. There's no chair, there's no nothing. So the only thing worse than a Juliet balcony is to actually be given a balcony that's not even big enough to put a chair on, which is, you know, the 2-foot little, you know, cheaply based on the front. That really is only for the building articulation and doesn't have anything to do with usability. Again, I wish I had my pictures from the limestone loft building. They actually punched the balcony in. So the balcony comes out a couple of feet, but it also is pushed back into the space. There's nice articulation associated with those balconies and a reasonable depth such that probably we could get a table and chairs out there. So that's one of the kinds of things that we regulate. The other one that's incredibly frustrating to us is what we would call a gallery. The space that might be like an arcade or a gallery where there's a column and a roof of some kind going over to a building. When that is set so small that two people with umbrellas cannot pass inside it, you've failed. Right? Because on a rainy day, everybody wants to be inside the gallery, and who's going to put down their umbrella just to walk your building's length and then have to put it back up again? So really, there's a certain depth to a gallery that has to be respected to make you feel comfortable in it and to keep it functional. It's supposed to be protection from sun, wind, rain, etc. So there will be some rules for some of those elements. Finally, the final piece is there are options for different frontages. So when we talked about the kinds of places that these places are, we may need different frontages. Would you skip on down to the frontages, past the pages, past those? There. So, for example, we have a village frontage. This is the most urban main street of the frontages. It actually resets some of your numbers. So it resets your build to zone and pulls the building even closer out to the street, 0 to 10 instead of 5 to 15. And it requires 90% build to, meaning I want a building across your whole property. The most you're going to get is is a driveway into rear parking or a way to get around your building to the back. That fundamentally the village frontage is for a Main Street setting. Most of the rules still come from the other piece, but other things get tightened up. The entrance spacing here is tightened up to 40 feet from 50 feet, and it's intended for small retail tenant spaces. So you would not apply this on some big stretch of roadway that you expect large buildings on. This is for the small buildings of the Eggertsvilles and Snyders of the world. Go on down to the next one. We have two more frontages for this area. One is called Green. Actually, stick with the picture for just a minute. So Green is pretty easy to understand. It's basically pushing the building back 10 to 30 feet, not allowing any parking in front, and therefore getting a deeper landscape frontage. As you come into Eggertsville, the first buildings on the north side are set substantially back, and there is actually a fair amount of green space there. And there's this transition from the residential neighborhood up to some commercial buildings behind green space, and then to the little Main Street. Right? So this is a tool that we could use to impact those kinds of places. And then the final one here is when we were originally looking at Eggertsville, and we were looking at the side streets, they immediately taper off into the residential neighborhood. You might want to allow commercial uses there. For example, there is, I believe it's an attorney's office right around the corner on Eggertsville from Maine. It's a yellow house with a mansard roof tucked behind a beautiful tree, so you don't notice it very much. And it's 2.5 stories, but it's not very wide, and there's a break, of course, between buildings. And as a pattern, it would be a very different pattern than the retail Main Street. So where you want to shift that pattern, probably on the edge of those side streets as you're coming in and out of places like Eggertsville, this is the tool you would apply as well. So think of these as little overlay districts that are manipulating a few of the numbers from the base district. We don't need these everywhere. The base district is going to do the heavy lifting most of the time, but in certain places we're going to turn the dials a little bit on particular things to get a particular outcome. So there will be different set of frontages for suburban than there are here. These are the frontages that go with tradition. So go back up. So I just want to show you at least one more example of one of these. So we're going to go from traditional to suburban medium scale. So we looked at traditional medium scale, and we were looking at Eggertsville. Yeah, Dave.
Hey guys, I'll be out there.
Sorry?
Back for a second and talk about the pedestrian access to the street.
It's a door.
It's saying that pedestrian access is required, so you have to be door.
Yes.
But for smaller properties, sometimes
If you're less than 100 feet deep, you're fine. You won't have a door. You can put a clip corner at the corner, and you're done. If it's 100 feet deep, so we set the side street, I think in the one we were reading, 100 feet deep. So if the door is at a clip corner in the front, if you basically put the door on the corner, that counts for both sides, the front and the side. And if your building was no more than 100 feet long, along that side, you'd be fine. So if you had a 65-foot deep building, just a bar building that was, residential or hotel or whatever above, and mixed use down below, not an L, you're going to be fine. You won't need any more door down that side. So now, if we have those miscalibrated, we can extend them. We are sensitive to the need in certain circumstances to get the side street to function. So you're in node. So in the node, we want the side street to be functional because we're thinking these are places with intersections. In the corridor, you're going to probably find, we might even have said NA. The idea doesn't apply. Because in the corridor, all we really care about is that you can get up and down the corridor among these uses. The side streets going into the neighborhoods are not intended to be functional, right? It's a different pattern of development. So if you're on Bailey, we're gonna set it focused on Bailey, and I don't really want a door on the side street, whatever the side street is. So we've tried to set those at reasonable numbers that that aren't impactful for the small project, especially. Anyway, this is a medium scale node. So now we're in suburban. So the biggest thing that's changing here, the build to zone is now 10 feet at least, because we've got to push suburban buildings back from the sidewalk because they can get up too close to the road otherwise. 90 feet max. So you have 80 feet of play. What can I do in 80 feet? I can do 2 bays of parking and a drive aisle and landscaping. And that all fits in that piece. So actually, I'm allowed to come up to 10 feet. I can bring my building right up to the edge as though it were a Main Street building. But I'm also allowed to be back at 90 feet or anywhere in between and provide parking in front of my building. This is the teaser parking that we frequently talk about. This is what makes the suburban model work. This is, Walgreens and all those guys' absolute favorite model is I'm driving by, I see there's a space, I think I need something, I go in, bam, instant sale, right? That is not the Main Street model. The Main Street model is get out of your car, walk up and down, park behind, park once, etc. This is the convenience suburban model. So again, if we stop and think about where we put these, so in town, sort of, to the south and west is all traditional, and to the north and east is mostly suburban, right? So these are the patterns that we're likely to see in those places. Now, even in suburban, we have said in one of the other sections that the internal streets act like main streets. So once you have gone inside a large block of land in the suburban area, you can put that parking around the outside edge, along Sheridan, along Transit, along Niagara Falls Boulevard. But once you have pierced into the center of a site, now you're on a small street that is servicing that site. And now we can pull the buildings back up. So this is really the outside edge of those suburban parcels along the big streets. We have dropped the build to 50%. That means half the site can be parking, half building. Right? At 50%, mostly buildings will turn interior to the site. Imagine the grocery store with its huge parking lot, right? The grocery store is not out at the street, facing Main Street. No, it's turned around sideways, and the grocery store may have a door up here by Main Street, but its door is in the middle of the parking lot, and that's who it's really serving. That's the suburban model. So 50% there, 30% of the building facade on the side street. So again, a very low requirement on that side street. We're not really caring about the fact that parking is sitting around this thing. On the common lot line, you can still go to 0 because you could have adjacent properties coming together in the mid-block. The parking setback's much more casual, 10 feet, and so that's how that parking gets to start, pretty much right away behind the sidewalk if you chose to. So a very different pattern of setback of the building on the lot and size of the building. You could build a Main Street building here. You could build 10 feet behind the curb, 90% of the width. There's nothing that keeps you from it, but you don't have to. It's not a requirement. Next page. And also then, the standards in the next piece are going to be very, very similar. So not a whole lot of change here, except for the longer building is possible. 300 feet instead of 200. Most of the rest of the metrics are about the same. This entrance spacing, again, we're now in a suburban environment. We're still in a node, not a huge center, not a deep parcel on a corridor, but in a small, medium-scale node. And so it's 80 feet between doors, 100 feet down the side street. Then there are some different frontages. There is a green frontage, and then the infamous internal street that I talked about. The internal street frontage is a more of a built-up environment. It's just not required to be 90% built up. But it does require that you orient in a formal way along the streets on the interior of the site. So if we take down the Boulevard Mall, it's not in this district, but if we took down the Boulevard Mall and we built 2 big streets and broke that up, that super block up, those internal streets would have development lined up along them. It would be a requirement. So let's show the next one just to show one more. So I also brought suburban corridor just so you could get a sense. So again, the ability to park in front, but no percent building facade on the side. Again, the corridor, the ends of the building along a corridor don't matter. The end of a building along Transit Road is not critically important. The end of a building where I have other intersecting streets that I care about would be important. Right? Mostly after that, the same setback. So, kind of one big change right there, down to 40% build out along that front lot line. That might mean, again, that you've turned a very large building sideways and the majority of the building is going interior to the site. Next page. I don't think there's any big surprises in here except that, again, along a corridor, if your parcel happens to be long enough between intersecting streets, you can have a really long building. It's not important. Everything along the corridor is all lined up there anyway. We have the pattern of streets. We're not going to break up corridor blocks likely with new streets, right? Because they wouldn't connect to anything back behind. That street pattern is set. So if you happen to have 400 feet of corridor with no intersecting streets, feel free to fill it with a building. This is a good place for large buildings. So that gives you some sort of sense of the way the metrics are working with these ideas about the character of the places that are in the comprehensive plan. I want to show you just a couple more things that are in here. Past here, its use. So we will have a use chart. The use chart has theoretically every district that's allowed and the kinds of uses that would be allowed in it. Certain uses might allow residential down to the ground floor. Certain districts might allow residential on the ground floor because we actually don't care if we have less retail in some settings, like along Transit Road or perhaps along Niagara Falls Boulevard. It might be okay to have full-on apartment buildings all the way down to the ground floor. On the other hand, if I'm in Snyder and Eggertsville, I want that mixed-use retail environment, at least in the core area. And so I'm not going to allow that use. And we'll be back to the upper story dwelling, which is an idea that's in your existing code, to allow only the residential in the upper floors. For the most part, you're seeing a strong pattern of the same thing being allowed in most of these places. Why is that? They're all mixed-use places. What would likely be different in these places? Notice all of these stars that are here. That means that there are some use standards that go along with those things. The use standards are likely to be... Yeah, go ahead, Dan.
This might be a little confusing to people. So folks understand, the districts would be listed across
The top. Yes, the table's cut off. Yeah, the table's cut off. So yes, each of those different colored things is one of those districts. And actually, if you went back to the district page itself, you would see a color, and that is the same color we're using here. So these things are keyed together. Eventually, it will make sense when you have the full document. And yes, there will be headers on the next version of the table. Sorry about that. The header, I think, is on the previous page. So, but that star means you have additional conditions that apply. One of the key additional conditions that we think we're going to use, if you remember, as a committee, we started talking about size of uses, and we thought about maybe putting that in the plan. It's possible we're going to put a maximum tenant size on certain districts, because tenant size impacts things like the frequency of the entrances, etc. Would we once again want a large department store in Eggertsville? Probably not, right? We want a finer grained set of uses. And so we're going to pick a number. I don't know what that number is right this minute, but we're going to set a ground floor tenant size for that area that will help manage the way people think about constructing their buildings and the kind of tenants that they chase after. And of course, when you're on the bigger corridors and deeper centers, in those places, all bets are off. So you'll see some uses are picked out as being perhaps too intense for certain districts. But for the most part, we are actually going to rely on scale of the tenant size to manage some of those kinds of things. It means you can have a grocery in a certain place that's 10,000 square feet. That's, basically not your weekly grocery, it's your daily grocery, right? And in another setting, you might have a 40,000 square foot grocery, and clearly in another one, you're going to have a 125,000 square foot grocery, right? We already have all of those in town. So those are all going to be enabled, but in various districts, to provide us with, kind of that district intent. If you want to do a bowling alley, laser tag, restaurant, pizza joint, it does not, its 40,000 square foot footprint does not belong in Eggertsville and Snyder and Kensington and whatever. But there is a place in town for it. It just doesn't happen to be there. Go ahead, Dave.
I understand that application.
Yes.
You struggle with ordinance.
Probably not. So that's why the stars are mostly on retail. I don't know what that star on office is.
You have a situation where you have a retail tenant
You clearly, like any other standard, you can ask to break it. And in certain instances, it may make sense to break it. But yeah, you're going to start with kind of the opinion that it's two different things. I would argue, there's interesting case law on this, and so it would kind of go against my argument. But I would argue if you took a second bay and all you did was put one door in between the two bays, that'd be fine with me. Leave the outside entrances, and make it act like two spaces. I'd be fine with your taking over the next tenant space. Now, in the town of Palm Beach, there is a very famous case where the Gap owned two adjacent spaces and just wanted to punch through the wall, and the town shut them down. It went all the way up to the district court, and they lost. The town won, and they have 2,000 square feet as the maximum tenant size. But that's because, Palm Beach was trying to be high-end boutique, and they knew that the larger a space they created, the more likely they were to attract outside chain kinds of things. And so there was a very strong intent there. I don't think we're going to, we're not turning the dial that far. But let's talk about that again when we get the use table built. Because I think that it's kind of a sensitive point for people that desire to have local retail in some of the nodes is I think very high in this community, as it is in many, and to the extent that we can accommodate that, if we think we have market pressure for it and whatever else, it's a really interesting question. On to the next, if you would. So the last thing I wanted to talk about from the code itself is the transitions. And you had seen these, at least we had talked about them briefly at the time of the charrette, on a shallow lot. And by a shallow lot, we mean something less than 200 feet deep. So at 200 feet deep, we're saying use the deep lot rules, but less than 200 feet deep, use the shallow lot rules. Now, for most people, a typical residential parcel is 125 or 150 feet deep. So if you're looking at a block like the Bailey Strip, that was originally, residential lot pattern there. And so those are very shallow. We cannot accommodate a deep transition. And so the design for the transition there is very intense. Right this minute, we're showing it as landscaping and a wall. The wall closest to the neighbor, the landscaping on the inside. The landscaping does presumably includes small trees and canopy trees, so that basically eventually you would not see the building. So this is what the shallow one is, and then in addition, there's the deeper one. The deeper one is a deeper setback, and it requires 20 feet of setback. On 200 feet and less, that would be taking 10% of your land area, and that seems a little excessive to most people. So the buffer there is tighter. The buffer here is a little more gracious. Now, there is an issue that we need to talk to you about this. Can you open up the other window there? So, you guys may remember, it's actually up there. There you go. You guys may remember this site. You can blow up the red part. Yeah, there. That's good. So, this is Wegmans at what and what? Help me out. There you go. So, this is Niagara Falls. It's actually oriented north-south. I love it. So, this is the Wegmans parcel. Let's imagine it wasn't the Wegmans. But let's say that we were applying a 5-story district to this. It is a large, deep parcel. There's a lot of land area left here, even with the Wegmans on there, and it's a huge parking lot. This is single family. That is single family. And there's a piece of multifamily. Now, this single family, unfortunately, is zoned multifamily. And that was because at the time, to get the lot sizes, you had to go to multifamily. But it's most of us would drive up and down the street and say it's single family because it's single family houses just happen to be on small lots. As it stands right now, if you used only the transition, I could have a 5-story building 20 feet away from this lot line. And I think most of us are kind of going, ooh, 5 stories right there, maybe that's a little much, right? Even if I don't have windows looking in my backyard and whatever, it's a bulky building there. It's 2 stories taller than my house. It's big. So we have 2 choices here. And one choice I'm hoping you'll help me eliminate tonight. In some communities, they would take a 3-story district and they would take a band 100 feet, maybe 200 feet deep into the site, and they would zone an L-shaped piece here for only 3 stories, just to make sure that transition was never out of alignment. That basically no transition was needed because the building was short enough, it was pretty much compatible with you. So that would be called split zoning, meaning we're putting 2 zonings on a single parcel of land. Not along a lot line. There's no lot line there. This would be just measuring into your property a certain depth and saying, whoop, right here, 3 stories, after that, 5. It builds a great transition. It's not that it doesn't do that. But the split zone is hard to manage. It has to be interpreted at the time the application comes in. It is a long-term challenge for the parcel. The more frequent answer is a bulk plane. So a bulk plane is something you guys have some substantial experience with in this town. It hasn't always worked right for you, and you've manipulated it recently to where, for the most part, it doesn't work for anybody except 3-story buildings. So the way a bulk plane works is usually at the lot line, you go up to the adjacent district height, and then you allow increased height by pushing the building back or stepping the building back underneath the plane. Now, typically around the country, a bulk plane is almost always 1-to-1, a 45-degree angle. 1 foot in for 1 foot of additional height. So if you have a 12-foot story, then you would move 12 feet back in, right? Or you would have a 3-story building and 12 feet back in the 4th story and 12 more feet back in a 5th story, the wedding cake, as it's sometimes called. A 1-to-1 bulk plane probably makes sense here. I think this community got rid of theirs, the one that I wrote previously, because of 1 building and 1 bad outcome. And I understand why that happened. But you adopted a 3-to-1 bulk plane. That says for every story of 12 feet, I'm moving 36 feet in. So to do 1 more story on my 3-story building, I've now got half of a building that I moved in. I either lose half of a set of apartments on top of a mixed-use building, something, but moving in 36 feet. So to get 1 more story, I am now my setback plus 36 feet back from the lot line, which is, I think in most communities would be considered too flat. So that bulk plane, went from its 1-to-1 at 45, down to 3-to-1 at, 33. So one possibility is that we manipulate this tool a little bit and make it work a little better for you. Right now, we would require a 20-foot setback in the first place for your landscape buffer on this deep site because you're going from commercial to residential. Can we start the bulk plane behind the landscape setback, in other words, 20 feet in already, and then start the bulk plane? If we did a 1-to-1 at that point, then the 1-story additional, the 4th story, is now 32 feet from the lot line. The 5th story is 44 feet from the lot line. Most people would probably consider that adequate in terms of light and air, in terms of pushing that building back. So the full-on 5-story building is almost 50 feet from the property line. I think that might be a good compromise. What I'd really like to ask, though, is can we eliminate the idea of using the split zone, this sort of pre-zoned perfect transition, in place of a more mechanical solution like the bulk plane that we're talking about? One of the principal reasons I would like to do that is we all may not be involved with the next rezoning, and we might get a really bad outcome if we don't have a mechanical measure in the code. If someone didn't split zone, let's say someone got together a bunch of sites down here and they didn't split zone them, you might find something too tall, once again, adjacent to residential, without anything more than our immediate transition. The immediate transition's good, but it's not enough for those 4 or 5, and potentially even 8, which is our tallest district, story buildings. Right now, we're not using 8 anywhere near any residential, so it's really the 4 and the 5 that we're worried about. How far would I push that stuff back? And to my mind, giving you a little more than you used to use by moving the landscape buffer to the outside of that and then pushing it back is probably enough. We can model that so that we can show it to everybody. But I'm mostly, I guess, asking for permission to eliminate the idea of tinkering with the split zoning on the sites. Is everyone comfortable with trying to work out the bulk plane as a replacement tool for split zoning some of these larger sites? Yes? Okay. Well, we'll continue to work on that. We'll have some drawings for it and some real SketchUp models that we can look at the next time around so that we can have a discussion of that. So what else did I have on my list? I believe that's it. Were there any questions? We are working to get you this whole draft. We are behind, and that's our firm's fault, so I'll apologize for that. But we are moving forward. We wanted to show you how the tools work tonight so that when you get them, you could kind of evaluate them. I know that people who build buildings will have an easier time with that than others, but we'll try to have some visual models with it that you can understand so that you'll have some sense of what each district will build. Dave?
So the, just kind of zooming out.
Yes.
Criteria that's established. And it's safe to assume that the work customized criteria is drawn from other plans that have been together.
Yes. Yes.
They've been somewhat tested, I guess.
They have.
So I guess the question I would ask is kind of how can you help us to that about how well tested, what are these things, how well tested they are?
So I would say that the pieces other than the half-story pieces are well tested. I am quite worried about the market and the impact of the half-story model making that bit dysfunctional. And there's nothing really we can do with testing it. The problem is if it happens to be family land or something like that, it's quite possible to build on, right? If you choose to bite the bullet and build some structured parking, it's very buildable. But those are exotic cases. And so I think that we are setting ourselves up for not a whole lot of change in those areas, which seems to come close to matching some community desire, so maybe it's not a bad thing. In trade for that, I think that the rules for most of the other places are fairly enabling. I don't think that there will be onerous in other settings. So there will be the most onerous in the low intensity traditional settings. So yeah, if you guys want to go test some of those and see if we could tweak them a little without impacting the height and some of those things, more power to you. We're glad to listen to some of that to see if there's a way that we could make those a little more buildable. But I think the rest is going to be fairly buildable, Dave. I have no concern about it. I have lots of built examples from other communities of those other levels. Maybe not at the parking standards that you have, but otherwise the buildings themselves are functional and buildable.
The second part of that question about the green okay, we have this new well now, so whoever needs to be able to and I think what we all want to do here is very also
So I think a couple of things. One, we've not really spent much time talking with the town about the development review within these districts. In many cases, when we provide quite prescriptive standards, we also provide an option that is not a variance, called alternative compliance. And we haven't spoken about this here, so I don't know how this idea might sell and whether we could work a model out. Alternative compliance actually typically pre-specs some options for people. We give you the example of, the grocery store trying to come into the Main Street center. The grocery store needs a whole wall full of coolers, and so they can't put transparency on that wall. The movie theater might need the same thing, right? Those are special circumstances. And yes, you could just go get a variance, and ask for a variance, claiming hardship, etc. That's not really the best option. The best option is to talk about the design of that side of the building and what you could do to make it intriguing to the pedestrian who has to walk past it. Because that's why you were putting the glass and the entrances in it. So on the movie theater, it's often, the movie boxes that have the posters in them. It's, some of those kinds of things. For the grocery store, it could be something, quite similar, something that could be active and changing, the equivalent of shop windows, but just as a small embedded case. So there were lots of ideas that we could provide, that we have provided in other communities, to say, with special permission, you can do the same thing a different way. You can achieve the same end a different way. That's one way to make prescriptive standards work better. The other would be to give some latitude in the site plan review process. And I don't know if that's possible at all. I don't know if that option has ever been considered here. But in many communities during site plan review, you have 10 and 15% ability to manipulate standards, whether it's the number of parking spaces, the percentage, of transparency, the spacing of doors, that kind of, 10 or 15% most of us can't even see on the building. It's just de minimis. Can we give ourselves that authority? So there might be some ways that we can soften that prescriptiveness procedurally to make this more functional. I would say that you do not have some of the worst problems. You do not have extreme topography. You do not have lots of kinds of problems that crop up with these kinds of rules. These work on flat sites with 90-degree corners. That's what this stuff is intended for. So, yeah, you're going to have some oddball sites. I know Millersport, is an angled road, and we're going to have some weird sites there, no matter what you do. So, yeah, there are going to be some places where you need some flexibility and some common sense. So you won't find us saying no to certain things. We'd say no to things like sign area variances, to things that frankly are just about gaining advantage over others. But we would allow for variances that are real practical hardships. So we hope to deal with that. We also often set very gracious non-conforming provisions so that you can phase your site. Your Hyatt site is a great example where now you're going back to talk about the restaurant pad in the parking lot. That's phased development. We're not going to make you meet your 90% on day one. You could meet it with one building at a time, eventually tear down the back building, or maybe never even tear it down. But being able to come in slowly, a piece at a time. If you're, what's the one just as you come off the freeway into town to the north, the big brick center that's there with the donut place? Walker Center. So the Walker Center is a great example. There are parcels that would be available up adjacent to the Main Street frontage. There's a huge parking lot there, but providing you thought about how parking could be done there, you could see some infill coming. It would never be conforming because you're never going to go all the way across that whole thing in a Main Street way. But could you bring up, a liner shop along there? Yes, you absolutely could. So non-conforming provisions is another piece you should be watching for. They help you meet that build too in a much more reasonable manner, extending existing buildings and phasing in parking lots and things like that. So I'm hopeful to have some flexibility, but there are some things you're still going to have to reach out and get a full-on variance for. Yes. Yes.
Where residents feel that they don't have, a venue or maybe their attitude and their objectives known in the decision-making process. So I think that we need to keep that in mind. We select these options that you're talking about. We need to make sure that they're not seen, and that in actuality they are opportunities for residents to come engage in the decision-making process, and it's not just a standard compliance of the existing.
Yes. Glad to talk about that because you're absolutely right that once you've asked to modify things, you should be in a different conversation. But the beauty of alternative compliance is you're talking about design, not about hardship and whatever. You're really just saying there's a design intent here. Can you meet it in a more creative way? It's a great conversation to have with the community. Yes.
Along those same lines, where you were talking about building that
Yes.
and having 200-foot, and then you talk about building development.
Yes.
Do those merge in some fashion? I know here we had a problem, especially with senior housing, apartment complexes, where they were building straight walls. Now have the offset required so often. Different demonstration issues. I hate to see, that last wall block here. Not something we want to have. So, do those other issues?
They need to. So we would often include articulation standards as well. And the main thing that these do is the metrics of articulation match or exceed the requirement for those elements. So yes, it can be a notch, but it could also be an any balcony, right? And yes, you could take credit for doing it either which way. And usually, when you present those concepts to the developer, at a certain point, they, the little light bulb goes on, and they see they can double dip. So the elements are not typically required. It's just if you are going to build them, they must be built this way. So the balcony is a great example where the slab can continue through, the building is cut back in and sits on the slab. You get an outdoor piece that is sitting, on top of the exact same slab. That's the kind of thing that's relatively inexpensive to build. The articulation is less expensive in that instance. And we set kind of natural breaks like 4 feet instead of, 5.5 feet or, something else to try to get at some of those things to make them more naturally buildable. So yes, I think they're not formally merged in the document, but yes, they show up in the drawings as, the same building breaks and articulation. Yes, in the buildings, yes. So you will see it in that same way. And in fact, the way that we illustrate some of those requirements is typically just to zoom in on what we've already drawn elsewhere. Anyone else? So we're getting somewhere. I want you to have confidence that we are headed in the right direction. We'll bring you all of the little dials and knobs to turn yourselves here at a certain point. We'll bring you a little ability to look at some SketchUp models and other things so that you can understand how these sites look different from one another. We are right this minute focused on getting some of the graphics for the comprehensive plan because that's going to be before the town board very quickly here, we hope. So we'd like to finish off the graphics for the comprehensive plan. So we're focused a little in my office on that right this minute, but we are then immediately turning back to trying to finish out these pieces. The newest, of course, revelation now that we have to look a little harder at parking. And so that would take us a little bit to come up with a proposal, vet that, especially with the building commissioner who's been doing the alternative parking plans so far and has a pretty good sense of what's been working and not working. So we'll try to get that done in the next short while, and then you'll get the draft. These were pages from the draft that you're looking at. So this is what the document is going to look like. As a reminder, the full code is headed this direction. So even the older portions of the code may get some illustration. They'll be more tabular. They'll be perhaps more colorful, and you'll be looking at the remainder of the code in similar fashion at some point before the end of the project. So, Dan, did we miss anything?
Last thing I think we wanted to make folks aware
Meeting
of.
dates.
Okay, so. But the last thing I think we want to talk about was some of the activities that are ongoing. So Lee alluded to it a moment ago. For those of you that don't know, the planning board recommended the comprehensive plan to the town board at their meeting in September. So the first hearing for by the town board for the comprehensive plan amendment will be on October 30th. And we're kind of excited about that. We want to push that along and get it out there and let the board consider that. We would ask that you participate in that hearing if you would, or be there to support us. We'll make a little presentation to the board. We'll get some public comment. We've gotten some, as you may or may not know. The planning board has had several sessions of a hearing over the course of the last couple of months, and we have gotten some feedback from different members of the community. I suspect we'll probably hear a little bit more over the course of the next month or so as the town board considers it as well. So any participation on your part is certainly welcome. Tomorrow evening, Lee will be meeting with the planning board at the end of their meeting to go through some of the things we talked about tonight and give a general update on where the project is and where the code is with the rest of the planning board. I know we have a couple members here tonight. So that'll occur tomorrow night after it's the last item on the agenda, so it'll be a little later in the meeting. Yeah. Well, maybe. We'll see. Depends on who else is here. I mentioned the town board meeting. The next meeting of the Technical Advisory Committee will be November 1st. Now, we hope to have a chunk of the code document itself so the Technical Committee can begin to go through that. And then a week later, we'll have another joint meeting, or certainly we'll have an opportunity for a joint meeting. We'll have the working committee get together on November 8th to go through that product. So we're going to follow the same protocol we followed up to this point. Staff will be looking at things. The technical committee will look at it, and then we'll get it to the committee, so the working committee to move along. So that's the schedule, the upcoming schedule for the next month. And you know, we apologize for the scheduling. Understand that it'd be nice if you could set dates a little bit further ahead than a month or a couple weeks, but we're still striving to move the code product along. We hope that the town board will have an ample opportunity to consider the plan amendment. This town board, the sitting town board, will have ample opportunity to consider that plan amendment, and the code will follow along. It's not likely we'll get the code to the town board before the end of the year in its final form, but hopefully we'll get a product to them. So members like Ramona, who've been working very hard on that over the last couple of years, will have an opportunity to have the code available to speak to that before the end of the year. That's the objective at this point. Am I forgetting anything? That's it. Rick, did you have anything you wanted to? Okay, Lori. Will the plan graphics be ready for the October 30th meeting?
Yes, that's the intent.
That's the intent, right? So, and I suspect that town board hearing will occur over a couple of their meetings. So, there should be opportunity for folks to look at those.
Right, the town board meetings are October 30th, and the next one is November 20th, and December 11th.
Okay. Lee, anything else?
Nope.
Okay. Anybody on the committee have anything they wanted to talk about with the rest of the group at this point? If not, Dal, I'll turn it back to you.
Not everybody's a giant. Any public comment?
As far as a plan amendment.
Mr. Frank,
consideration,
would you come up?
My name's Thomas Frank, and I'm suggesting a plan amendment having to do with the Ellicott Creek watershed for inclusion in the plan as far as the graphics for the 53.5 square mile town of Amherst, that it should, and this is being called for by and they just had the Great Lakes Restoration Conference, where people were here from all over the country as far as these various different green codes. And this is a long-range plan to restore the town of Amherst ecosystem. As far as the drainage into Ellicott Creek, that's the major artery. And what I'm suggesting is that the watershed drainage pattern include all of the tributaries into Ellicott Creek, and that this is a major long-term And it has to do with, as far as the NYSERDA, the reason why they gave the grant for this project, it has to do with the purpose was to mitigate the cumulative negative impact on the town of Amherst as far as over 50 years through 2057. And this came up at the public hearing having to do with the comments for the Westwood Pharmaceutical Country Club development. As far as the neighborhood, one of the neighbors showed the United States Army Corps of Engineers the survey that was done for the relicensing of the power project as far as the sinking houses. And as far as they wanted more money to complete the study, and they said, the planning department said, no, it's buyer beware. And this information, long-term, as far as what's going on throughout the Great Lakes watershed, is amazing as far as the infrastructure, and there's an opportunity here as far as a positive environmental opportunity, and the people from the University of Buffalo, the School of Architecture and Planning, they're involved. This is a coalition of agencies that have been around for quite some time, and the Ellicott Creek is the central part of the town of Amherst, and this is an opportunity to be able to interact. But also it has to do with the groundwater. What do they call the heating system? Yeah, geothermal heating. Okay, thank you for that. Okay. Appreciate it. You're welcome.
Just to reiterate what Dan said, on October 30th, the town board will hold a public hearing, and if you can attend, that would be great to get the support. Anything else? If not, we can go watch the Yankees beat Houston. Thank you. Have a good night.
Well, that's the